At the start of free agency, the New England Patriots, they had the most cap space in the entire league. And boy, did Bill Belichick get off to an early spending spree. Here to break down some of the players they signed and the fantasy impact. SI fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano. Fabs, we know Cam Newton's coming back on a 1-year deal. Now the Patriots, they're going out and getting some weapons for him. Let's start off with the tight ends they signed.
Boy, I tell you, when I heard that Jonnu Smith signed with New England, I was pretty ecstatic. I'm like, oh man, top 10 potential. And then Hunter Henry comes along and shatters my hopes and dreams for Jonnu Smith. The Patriots overall have added 313 targets so far. They haven't lost any. That's not going to be the case when free agency is over, of course. But let's look at the numbers. Last year, they were dead last in running 12 personnel. That's obviously going to change big time. Let's go back to the time when they had Rob Gronkowski and Aaron Hernandez, when both of those guys were top 10 fantasy tight ends. And you look at the target shares during those years in 2011 specifically. Gronkowski was over 20% in terms of the target share. Aaron Hernandez close to 19% of the target share. Will that be something that both of these players can accomplish in 2021? Not so sure about that. And oh, by the way, Tom Brady was the quarterback back then. It's Cam Newton, at least we think, right now. So while I'm not going to not draft either of these players, certainly they're both far less attractive from a fantasy perspective because they'll be battling one another for that target share in New England with a quarterback who had 8 touchdown passes in 2020. So I would say Henry and Jonnu Smith are likely at least on the outside looking in terms of being a top 10 to 12 fantasy tight end. Disappointing because both of these guys, if they were playing in offenses as the featured tight end, could be top 10 players.
Yeah, and that's the kind of the crummy part, if you will, for fantasy players, because the tight end position already thin to begin with, and now you put two guys that, like you said, potentially could have been top 10 on their own. Now they're all of a sudden they're on the same team, maybe cannibalizing some of those targets off each other. Let's move over to wide receivers because the Patriots signed two relatively popular names among fantasy players in Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne.
And Aguilar's coming off a career season in Las Vegas, still finished as the wide receiver 30. So it wasn't a huge season, but from weeks 9 to 17, he was the wide receiver 20. That's pretty good. But here's the problem. You got a lot of mouths to feed right now. Okay, forget about Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne. Jacoby Myers is still under contract. N'Keal Harry's still under contract. Julian Edelman is still under contract, although I wouldn't be surprised if Edelman ultimately ended up in Tampa Bay with his pal, Tom Brady. But there's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. So suddenly, Aguilar going to New England, it certainly doesn't improve his value because he was the featured wide receiver for the Raiders last year. Will he be the featured wide receiver in New England with two tight ends in Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry running a lot of 12 personnel? I'm not so sure about that. And I would suggest this. As much as the Patriots have improved in the offseason by making these moves, Bill, from a fantasy perspective, this team could cause a lot of headaches.
Patriots signed a couple players on defense as well. We're not going to get into all of them as we're just focusing mostly on the fantasy impact. But you might see New England's defense and special teams climbing up some draft boards with some of these recent free agency signings as we get closer to draft season. Plenty more fantasy football strategy and advice. It never ends here at Sports Illustrated. Check it all out. Go to si.com/fantasy.